Thanks so much, Lori. Welcome, everyone. My name is Anna Nguyen, and I am a researcher at Dovetail. We're a platform that allows you to store your research and analyze all that customer data. And today I'm super excited to welcome you both to Kaylee and Vineet. Welcome.
Thank you.
Hey, Anna. Thanks for having us.
Of course. And maybe, Kaylee, do you want to kick us off by telling us about your role and Atlassian?
Yeah, sure. I should mention I'm getting over a cold, so my voice is quite croaky at the moment. Excuse me. So apologies to those who are watching. So I'm a researcher at Atlassian. I've been with Atlassian for about 4 months. I work in our open DevOps business, which helps our customers basically do DevOps. So shipping their code and getting it out the door into people's hands. Previously, I was at Coles for about 9 months, which is one of Australia's largest supermarkets, heading up the research team there. And prior to that, I was at Seek, which is one of Australia's largest job boards. That's all from me.
Thanks, Kaylee. And feel free to take any water breaks if you need. I totally understand the feeling of being live and needing to take a water break. So totally fine. And Vineet, tell us about you and your world at Postman.
Yeah, I think I just did a quick introduction with the talk, but just to reiterate, I work as the director of UX at Postman. Been there a while, so have sort of like seen it scale, have had the luxury of having a lot of failed experiments in that time. So hopefully have learned a few from that, and maybe, I can share a few of those now.
Awesome. Thank you both for your introductions. And speaking of research, maybe Vineet, I'll start with you. I'd love to hear how research is structured at your organization.
Absolutely. So we started off with research being centralized, but always working within specific domains for specific initiatives. So at a time, you would always be focusing on a certain part of the product at the end of the day. But I think over time, it became very, very, very apparent that there were two kinds of research that needed to be done. So there was a certain set of high-level research on our users and the user experience, which couldn't be done by any team other than a centralized team. They needed to have that global perspective. But there were also smaller research initiatives at a feature level or at a product level, which was much more democratized in the sense that product managers were doing it, UX generalists were doing it, etc. So over time, we've gotten to a point where we have now a dedicated research and strategy team that looks at centralized research and to some extent governs how other product teams or the research requirements of other product teams. But our product teams are built out in a way where they're completely free and independent to do any research they want on their own. In practice, it's mostly secondary research, but yeah.
That's awesome. So at Postman, it sounds like most of the research is centralized, but it sounds like the researchers also have the freedom to conduct research they're interested in, which is really great to hear. And Kaylee, does it differ for you much at Atlassian?
Yeah, so excuse me. So sorry. I would consider our research function to be a hybrid. So we have qualitative researchers embedded in product teams. For example, I work with 2 product squads, and they are effectively my product team. So I go to all their meetings. I attend any decision-making session with the product manager, the engineering manager, and the designers. However, the researchers report up into a centralized research group. So I report into a research manager for my product space, and we all ladder up into the head of research, which sits within our customer experience organization. So within research, while our qualitative researchers are embedded, we have a centralized quantitative research team and a centralized ops team, and they basically help all of us get stuff done. So I guess our closest friends in the organization, apart from other researchers, are designers. And I think that structure works really well in that because you're an embedded researcher, you understand the product a lot better, you work with your stakeholders a lot more closely. And as a result of that, the research you conduct is ultimately more fit for purpose and it gets used because you understand the product and the team understands what you do.
Yeah, that's awesome, Haley. I totally relate with that, like being embedded in team. You can really dive into like your product teams, goals, the pain points of your customers there. So totally relate to that. And it sounds like both of you have this common theme of having a centralized UX or research team. I'd love to hear from either of you how you balance giving non-facing research team members enough context on research without overwhelming them.
Vinny, I don't know if you want to go first there.
I'll let you have this one.
Yeah, so this is the tricky one, and it's something I've seen crop up in all the places I've worked. I think it's a balance of pushing the information out, but also bringing the information in depending on context. So when I mean, excuse me, when I say pushing the information out, I'm talking about running showcases with your stakeholders in the broader organization, maybe disseminating research insights through newsletters or updates, either via email or Slack or whatever it is, running workshops to share insights when they're really fresh, creating a bit of a research repository, even if it's rudimentary, so people can jump in and kind of soak in the data if they want to. Just don't get too precious about who has access to what. You ultimately want your research to be used. So that's kind of one side of it, is pushing the information out there. But there's also bringing the information in. I think as a researcher, you have a responsibility once the research is complete to keep bringing up that research and to keep sharing it and keep reminding people it's there. Get yourself into the right forums, get yourself into the places where decisions are being made, and repeat that research information, repeat that data. Also rely on triangulation. So looking at research data you might have collected and pairing that with maybe some quant or analytics to kind of really strengthen your argument. Rely on other people to share it and kind of help you advocate for your research and for the data. So you've kind of got to be everywhere. So yeah, I guess to summarize, it's a balance of pushing it out, but also bringing into the places where you are.
Yeah. And Vinny, do you have anything to add to this?
I think Kaylee pretty much covered like all of it, but like I just wanted to reiterate on leaning heavily towards insights in Postman, because that's the kind of information that a centralized research team can provide, which individual research functions in product teams might not be able to do. I think the hardest part when you're working in a product team and listening to your users on a day-to-day basis, you're getting on calls with them, you're getting a lot of passive feedback through feedback channels, and you're doing your own secondary research on top of that. The hardest part here is to be able to figure out, which feedback is relevant, how much feedback is noise, how much feedback is stuff I can actually, work upon. So, and the danger there lies in actually relying on it, anecdotally at the end of the day. The centralized research team is building out stuff at like a higher level. So they are the best people to sort of like gauge, what's noise versus what's not. And that input coming from like the centralized teams, that form of dissemination is invaluable, in my opinion.
Oh yeah, totally agree with that one. And I think we've spoken about centralization. I'm keen to hear maybe your experiences, perhaps being in a decentralized research team. What are some of your thoughts on pros and cons? Maybe Kaylee, you can kick off this one.
Yeah, sure. So you were asking about pros and cons of centralized or decentralized research?
Decentralized.
Okay. Yeah, so I guess because I was at Seek for a very long time and we had quite a decentralized research function, what I'm going to talk to will be reflective of those experiences at Seek. I think the pros of decentralized research is that designers can really take charge of their own research for their own product. So it's really beneficial to have a designer who understands their customers, who sees customers interact with their designs, because it builds empathy of what the customer goes through and means that if a designer sees it firsthand, they're more likely to believe that it's true. And the same goes for product managers too. I think empathy is the biggest pro actually. And it kind of makes it easier to really push for the change that customers want if people are seeing it with their own eyes. And it also means that the researchers can focus on tackling maybe some juicier problems. So not just testing designs or concepts, but maybe looking into future focused research or looking into the strategic problems the business wants to tackle. I guess, cons though. Excuse me. I'm speaking from experience here. If you're not careful, your researchers can turn into a bit of an ops function, which is not something that all researchers want. So if you are going to turn towards decentralized research, I'd recommend really carving out what research it is that your designers and product folk do and what research it is that your researchers do, so your researchers have that purpose. And the researchers can also become quite disconnected from the products if they're not working directly on the products themselves. So as a result of that, they may not have the context they need to deliver really fit for purpose insights. So yeah, I guess it's important to kind of give your researchers, sorry, my phone's going off. It's really, sorry, I might hand over to
Vineet. Vineet, I'd love to hear from you. I was spying on your talk just before this, and it was really cool to see like the research team or UX team was quite small in 2019 and 2020 to today. It's grown quite a bit. Have you seen any of this pros and cons that Kelly has mentioned around digital research?
Yeah, absolutely. The way I like to think of it, if you have like a linear scale between like centralized and decentralized, what you're sort of like trying to find the balance between is like on this, if there's too much centralization, you're probably not building enough empathy because you're not working deep enough in the product to actually understand user pain points at some level. And if there's too less centralization, you're always sort of focusing on the immediate problem. So going back to what Kaylee mentioned about, at some point being able to have the freedom to think longer term and do research that maybe affects the roadmap 2 years down the line rather than now, that is just not possible when you're doing decentralized research, in my opinion. So that's like the linear scale. Like it completely depends at like what scale of a team you are, what's the right kind of balance you're trying to find, and depending on that you might want to choose between a level of centralized or decentralized.
Yeah,
I might jump in there. That's okay, Hannah. I just
go
wanted
for
to
it.
finish what I was making before.
Of course.
Yeah, so in terms of another couple of cons for having decentralized research, when researchers are working on those bigger, more strategic things, that's really good, but it also means they have less context on the product teams and what they're working on, which means the research can become less useful. And also you might end up with researchers getting swamped with requests to review research work from other designers, and it can get a bit too much. So you really want to have that balance between the researchers doing some strategic work, but also being close enough to the product that they can execute on those research projects and really understand them when necessary.
Thanks, Kaylee. And I think you both mentioned a theme of balance, which is super relatable and super interesting. I'd love to hear, and I could both imagine you're super busy in your world of UX and research, how you balance between, giving the training to non-UX facing roles and allowing them and letting them feel empowered to run their own research. Kaylee, happy for you to take this one.
Yeah, sure. Excuse me. So yeah, this is really about making sure you're getting maximum impact from more effort. Obviously, training UX designers and product folk and whoever else to run research is a lot of work. When I was at SEEK, the first thing I did when decentralization was getting talked about is set up a bit of a wiki of how-to guides and templates so designers and product managers could self-service as much as they needed to. I find that typically designers and PMs are conducting things like user interviews or concept testing. So maybe start off with some guides around how to run user interviews, how to run concept testing, set up some templates that people can just sort of take and edit to suit their own purpose. You could also set up some, excuse me, office hours rather than having people, rather than having people sort of coming at you with lots of requests to review things, getting them all to come to you in sort of 1 hour will mean that it's not going to take you as much time to review different pieces of research that are going on. Even just basic, like how to ask questions that aren't leading or how to recruit for a particular segment, all those things are really useful. yeah, that's all I'll say there.
Awesome. And Vinny, do you have anything to add to this? Like, how do you keep the team at Postman, on track of this and having enough training to feel confident to run research?
Yeah. And this is where I just want to like bring back the idea of the centralized team working with product teams on certain low-level initiatives. Just because the centralized team sort of like gets to show everyone how it's done. So you have the product managers and the designers who are working with the product team who are actively learning from centralized UX researchers on how they do research. And to some extent, they're replicating it during the initiative. And once that initiative is done, they come out of it a lot more confident and independent to do it themselves. Obviously, there's a lot of educational material and wikis and guides around this, but I feel like that one interaction of like active listening is just super helpful. And it also builds a certain relationship between centralized and decentralized teams where once you've sort of like done a run through of like how a centralized team would do research, the designers, the product managers in those product teams, they know who to reach out to if they need like certain questions answered. They know who can sort of like help them and guide them. It's almost like having like a mentor available whenever they need some help with research. I think at the scale we're at, and so far, that's really helped, and that's worked pretty well.
Thanks, Vinny. It's really cool to hear from both of you. So it sounds like at both Atlassian and Postman and your past roles, you have like a template to kind of the theory there. But it also sounds like it's really important to have, that listening ear, that team that people go to when they do need that extra support. So that's awesome to hear. I might actually sidetrack a little bit. Kaylee, I was listening in your talk yesterday around building an organizational user research culture. Super interesting, super cool. And something that you mentioned is one, you said democratizing research is really hot right now, which totally agree with that. But the other thing you said that was really interesting was you said, doing research is the easy part, but it's actually the research getting used, which is where things get a little bit tricky. So I kind of love to hear like, how do you let the research like live and breathe and have impact, especially the research conducted by designers and product managers, for example?
Yeah, so I'll start with the designers and PMs. I found that in the past, and this is just speaking from my own experience, research conducted by designers and PMs is typically more likely to be used. And I say that because it's usually more tactical. It's usually conducted on the product for that quarter's initiatives. So it might be things like improving conversion or doing a bit of discovery for a particular initiative. And because it's in the here and now, it's very topical and the team are kind of ready to deliver it. When you're a researcher and maybe you're not doing as much of that tactical stuff and you're doing more of the strategic stuff, that's where you've got to get a little bit sneaky, or at least you got to get a little bit smart with how you think about where your insights are going to go. So I've heard this referred to as the research long tail, like what happens to the research after it's complete. When you complete a piece of research and it is really strategic, you might do an initial share back with the stakeholders and go, right, this is what we found out. And people go, oh, that's really interesting. And you're like, okay, great. But that doesn't mean it's going to be used necessarily. So this is where you start to ask your stakeholders, people who might be in the strategy team or people who are maybe higher up in the product chain, what document does this research live in? Does it live in a strategy deck? Does it live in our plans for the next, financial year or something? Try to find out what those longer term artifacts are so you can insert your research findings into those. Another thing, yeah, so it's tricky because it's different for every organization, but an example I'll share from Seek is we were looking at, I guess, our strategy for the higher level product spaces for the next couple of years. And I just happened to hear from one of the strategy managers that this workshop was going on. And I said, oh, yeah, it sounds like you could use some longer term research insights in there. Invite me to that workshop. So I just invited myself. So I guess the takeaway here is to be a bit cheeky. Don't be afraid to invite yourself to those forums where decisions are getting made if you hear about them. And also be really upfront and sort of ask these key people, where do you think these insights should live? What are they contributing to, and where is that documented? So you can get that research in there.
Well, that's awesome. Love that little cheeky tip there, Kaylee. And Vinny, what about you? Any thoughts on this? Anything you'd like to add?
Yeah, I totally love that part about just getting there in those meetings and getting stakeholders to sort of like listen to it. Especially effective, I think, with leadership to some extent. I think the other part to this is probably more bottoms up, research adoption, in the sense that what we've found is if research and product and design, they're all at some level talking the same language or using a framework that effectively communicates things that the product managers are interested in, things that the designers are interested in, things that researchers are interested in. There's some amount of communication happening. So I've talked about this before. Like for us, that's the jobs to be done framework. If everything in Postman is being framed around a user job, it just makes it easier to consume to some extent. So product managers, they start off their problem space exploration with jobs. Designers are actually designing workflows based on those jobs, and researchers are at the end of the day validating or fleshing out those jobs more. Just having that, it sounds very pretty and like it is super idealistic when I say it that way. In reality, it's a lot more dirty and messy. But I think in principle, just having that common layer of communication makes collaboration between research and other teams much more effective.
Thanks, Vinny. And yeah, it does sound pretty when you outline it like that. Vinny, I actually have a question for you. So in your talk just now about foundation teams for UX, you mentioned that like the UX team kind of sits in two pillars: product design, and then you've got your UX foundations team. Bit of a juicy question, but who do you think owns democratization? Is it both of those teams, one of those teams? Thoughts on this?
I don't think, for example, democratization is necessarily a vested interest for foundational teams. Just because the entire problem they're trying to solve is centralizing stuff. There's stuff we've seen go wrong to a point where we absolutely need to centralize it, and that's why some of those foundation teams exist. For the product design teams, a lot more so, but I think to some extent, it's an org-wide responsibility. Like I don't think you can take like a decision on the structure of the design org without getting like feedback from like engineering and product, because like everyone's going to get affected by it at the end of the day. So at some level, democratization of research of whatever it is going to be an org level decision that needs to be or have the get-go from like everyone.
Interesting. And Kaylee, what about you? What are your thoughts on whose job do you think it is to democratize research?
Yeah. I'm smiling because it's quite a funny question. I think while a lot of researchers might say it's researchers' job to democratize research because you want to put in those guardrails around how research gets conducted and making sure it's of a high quality, I do think it's everyone's job. And I say that because there is no point in a research team putting together a bunch of resources and training if people aren't going to take them up on that. I think the other folks in the org who might want to be doing research, A, they need to want to do it, B, they need to want to do it well. Research isn't just going and having a conversation with a customer. You need to think about what it is you want to get out of that conversation. You need to think about where you're storing that data so you can use it again. So I think it's everyone's job, and it's everyone's job because I think there needs to be a level of respect for the research practice and what the research discipline means. And I think, yeah, with that comes a bit of like accountability from other people in the organization. So yeah, they need to come to the table and willing to learn, I guess.
Yeah, that totally makes sense. And Kelly, you touched on something interesting. You mentioned high quality research. I'm kind of keen to hear how you keep people aware of the time sensitivity of the data or research that you have.
Sure. So a rough rule of thumb that I normally tell stakeholders is for strategic research or research where we're looking at people's behaviors, needs and wants. Those things don't change very quickly. So you can trust that a piece of research looking into that sort of stuff is maybe valid for a few years at least. For things like the results of concept testing or the results of usability testing, that's not going to last as long because those designs change. They might change with like little bits of iteration, or they might change with a bit more detail. So yeah, like normally in my past organizations, I've sort of given those rules of thumb to people and said, yeah, strategic data, you can use it for a bit longer. But in terms of policing how that data gets used and where it gets used, you really just can't. It's one thing to do amongst many things, particularly if you don't have a dedicated research ops team. So yeah, the best thing you can do is just try and make sure people aren't using data that's too old when you can.
Yeah, I think I totally agree with that. And I'm keen to hear from you, Vinny, if you have any rules of thumbs for how long research should be used for.
Yeah, I think I'm a bit more flexible when it comes to this, like in the sense that I feel like as long as the data is kept in context of the timeline, I think there is value in even, looking back at historical data just to sort of derive insights. Because we've faced the problem where, because you don't have necessarily context on like historical decision making or research, like you keep going back into mistakes that you shouldn't have. You made a mistake 2 years ago, you learned from it, you iterated, and then like 2 versions down the line, you're sort of like iterating and going back to the same mistake just because whoever is working on it just didn't have context of the earlier research and the earlier decision making, etc. So I think as long as the data is presented in context of the timeline, it's in a format that can be, I guess, like every designer, every product manager can take the best decisions there by themselves. The real risk is just not having it in that context at the end of the day.
Yeah, totally. Context definitely makes a huge difference. I do have one last question before I let you go. I'm keen to hear from you both, like what excites you the most about the democratization of research.
Maybe I can take a stab at this first. I think both Kaylee and I touched upon this. For me, the biggest draw is just building empathy. The more you centralize something like research, the more I feel you take away certain expectations from every single person in the product team around knowing your users, knowing what affects them the most, knowing what job they're out there to do, knowing where your product fails and where it's great at. And that at the end of the day is going to hinder your ability to build better products. I think it's a lot more visible for us in Postman because we are a team of designers who are building products for developers. We are not even the target persona, so it's just a lot, like the need for empathizing with developer workflows is just like a lot more evident to us, and that's like we've seen situations where not having that empathy can lead to really terrible decisions sometime. So I think the biggest draw is just building empathy at the end of the day.
Thanks, Vinny. And any quick thoughts from you, Kelly?
Yeah, I'd echo the point about building empathy. That's amazing. But also from a research perspective, it means that you can do so much more stuff if you've got designers and product managers taking care of the more tactical pieces of research, and everyone in the team has empathy for who you're building for. It means the researchers can focus on the future and what the organization could and should be doing for its customers in the future, which means we're solving more problems. And that's really exciting.
Yes, totally agree. Well, thank you both so much. Really, really keen and inspired by all your thoughts today. Kelly, I hope you feel better. And for everyone, thank you for all your questions. We will be posting it on Slack, and Vinny and Kelly will be jumping on there to answer them. So thank you both so much.
Thanks, Anna. Thanks, Kate.
Thanks.